Hey, you there in the costume, stop right there.
Excuse me, officer. I'm Captain Carter. I need to board my aircraft.
Yeah, right. Where'd you get that uniform, a Halloween store?
I'm the assigned pilot. Here's my FAA license and airline ID.
Anyone?
On April 20th, 2024, at 4:20 p.m., Captain Tyrone Carter walked confidently through JFK Airport in his crisp pilot uniform. He was ready to command Flight 447 to Los Angeles. He carried his flight bag with pride, not knowing that his routine walk to the gate would become a viral nightmare. What happened next was captured on multiple cameras and would cost New York City $12.8 million in the largest police misconduct settlement in the city's history. JFK Airport Terminal 4 buzzed with the usual Saturday afternoon energy. Hundreds of travelers moved through the massive space, pulling suitcases and checking flight information on the overhead screens. Gate B-23 sat in the middle of this controlled chaos, where passengers waited to board their flights to destinations across the country. The terminal's bright lights reflected off the polished floors as families said their goodbyes and business travelers rushed to catch connections. Captain Tyrone Carter had walked through these same corridors thousands of times before. At 34 years old, he was one of the youngest African-American captains at his airline, an achievement that filled him with quiet pride every time he put on his uniform. The crisp navy blue jacket with its gold captain's stripes represented 12 years of hard work, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence in aviation. Carter's journey to the cockpit had not been easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, he had dreamed of flying since he was a small boy watching planes cross the summer sky. His parents worked multiple jobs to support his education, and Carter never forgot their sacrifices. He graduated magna cum laude from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where he was one of only a handful of black students in his aviation program. The challenges he faced there only made him more determined to succeed. After college, Carter served in the Air Force Reserve, where he honed his flying skills and learned the discipline that would define his career. His transition to commercial aviation came naturally, and he quickly earned a reputation as a pilot who never cut corners when it came to safety. His colleagues respected his calm demeanor under pressure and his ability to handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism. At home, Carter was a devoted family man. He and his wife Sarah had been married for 8 years and had 2 young children who looked forward to hearing stories about Daddy's flights. Carter often spoke at local schools, encouraging young people to pursue careers in aviation. He volunteered with organizations that helped minority students learn about opportunities in the aerospace industry, knowing how important it was to see someone who looked like them in the cockpit. Carter's professional record was spotless. In 2,047 flights as a captain, he had never had a single safety incident or passenger complaint. His airline had recognized his excellence with their leadership award 3 years in a row. If fellow pilots often requested to fly with him, and flight attendants knew they could count on his steady leadership during any emergency. On this particular Saturday, Carter felt the familiar satisfaction that came with preparing for another flight. He had completed all his pre-flight checks and was looking forward to the smooth flight to Los Angeles that the weather forecast promised. As he walked toward Gate B-23 with his regulation flight bag rolling behind him, Carter had every reason to expect that this would be just another routine day at work. He had no way of knowing that his life was about to change forever. Officer Aiden Pierce had been walking the corridors of JFK Airport for 15 years, and he thought he knew how to spot trouble. At 41 years old, the white officer had built what appeared to be a solid career with the Port Authority Police Department. His personnel file showed commendations for service, and his supervisors had always rated his performance as satisfactory. Pierce was married with a teenage son and lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where his neighbors knew him as a reliable family man who took pride in his work. Pierce had earned his criminal justice degree from a local community college before attending the police academy. His training had covered the basics of law enforcement, but like many officers of his generation, he had received minimal education about implicit bias or cultural sensitivity. Pierce believed he treated everyone fairly, but his actions would tell a different story. What Pierce's supervisors did not fully understand was the pattern of complaints that had been building against him over the years. These incidents, when viewed individually, had been dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. However, when examined together, they revealed a troubling trend that should have raised serious concerns about Pierce's fitness for duty. In 2019, a Hispanic businessman filed a complaint after Pierce subjected him to what the man described as excessive questioning during a routine security check. The businessman had been traveling for work and was simply walking through the terminal when Pierce approached him and demanded to know why he was loitering near the gates. Despite having a valid boarding pass and identification, Pierce questioned the man for nearly 20 minutes, asking repeatedly about his business in New York and whether he had permission to be in the country. The complaint was dismissed after Pierce claimed he was simply being thorough in his security duties. The following year brought another incident when an African-American family filed a complaint alleging racial profiling during what should have been a simple bag search. Pierce had singled out the family from a group of travelers and insisted on searching their carry-on luggage, despite their bags having already passed through security screening. The father later told investigators that Pierce made comments about how their luggage looked suspicious and questioned whether they could afford to fly first class. No action was taken against Pierce, and the complaint was filed away without further investigation. In 2021, a black airport employee reported Pierce for what he called a hostile interrogation. While the employee was accessing a restricted area for his job, the employee had proper identification and clearance to be in the area, but Pierce detained him for over 30 minutes, questioning his right to be there and calling his supervisor to verify his employment. The employee felt humiliated and embarrassed in front of his coworkers, but once again, no consequences followed for Pierce. The complaints continued into 2022, with two separate incidents involving Pierce questioning black travelers about the legitimacy of their presence in the airport. In one case, he demanded that a black businessman explain why he was using the airline's premium lounge, despite the man having proper membership credentials. In another incident, Pierce questioned a black woman about whether she had stolen the expensive jewelry she was wearing, suggesting that someone like her could not afford such items. Even more telling was an incident in 2023 when a Latino pilot reported that Pierce had demanded extra verification of his credentials and questioned whether his pilot's license was genuine. The pilot had been in uniform and was clearly heading to his aircraft when Pierce stopped him and insisted on calling the airline to confirm his identity. The complaint was dismissed as a misunderstanding, with supervisors accepting Pierce's explanation that he was simply being cautious about airport security. By early 2024, a black flight attendant had filed a formal complaint about Pierce's intimidating behavior toward minority airport workers. The complaint was still under review when the incident with Captain Carter occurred, but it had not resulted in any changes to Pierce's duties or additional training. The warning signs had been there for years, but Pierce's supervisors had failed to recognize the pattern. They saw individual incidents rather than a systematic problem with racial bias. Pierce's training records showed that he had attended mandatory diversity sessions, but his evaluations indicated minimal engagement with the material. Fellow officers later admitted that Pierce had made inappropriate comments about minorities over the years, but none had ever reported these remarks to supervisors. Pierce's colleagues would describe him as someone who took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. He prided himself on his gut instincts about suspicious behavior, never recognizing that his instincts were clouded by racial prejudice. Pierce genuinely believed he was protecting the airport and its passengers, but his definition of suspicious behavior was dangerously influenced by the color of people's skin. Pierce's personal background revealed some of the sources of his bias. His father had been a police officer in an earlier era, when discriminatory practices were more openly accepted in law enforcement. Growing up, Pierce had absorbed attitudes about race and authority that he never questioned or examined. His social media accounts, which he would later delete, contained posts that revealed his views about airport security and what he considered suspicious travelers. On the day he encountered Captain Carter, Pierce was conducting what he considered routine security surveillance. He had been patrolling Terminal 4 for several hours, watching travelers and looking for anything that seemed out of place. When he spotted Carter walking confidently through the terminal in his pilot uniform, something in Pierce's biased mind told him that this black man did not belong in that uniform. It was a judgment based entirely on prejudice, but Pierce would convince himself that he was following his professional instincts. The stage was set for a confrontation that would destroy Pierce's career and traumatize an innocent man whose only crime was being black while working as a pilot. At 4:15 p.m., Captain Carter arrived at Gate B-23 to find passengers already boarding Flight 447. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity as travelers lined up with their boarding passes and flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. Carter walked purposefully through the terminal corridor, his regulation flight bag rolling smoothly behind him on its wheels. His uniform was immaculate as always, the navy blue fabric pressed to perfection and his captain's stripes gleaming under the terminal's bright lights. From his position 50 feet away, Officer Pierce spotted Carter moving through the crowd. Something about the sight of this black man in a pilot's uniform immediately caught Pierce's attention. Later testimony would reveal that Pierce thought Carter looked out of place wearing the uniform of a commercial airline captain. The officer's biased mind could not accept what his eyes were seeing, and he began to focus his attention entirely on Carter. Pierce started walking toward the gate area, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon. His aggressive posture and determined stride suggested he had already decided that some kind of confrontation was necessary. Other passengers in the terminal continued with their travel plans, unaware that they were about to witness an incident that would shock the nation and cost the city millions of dollars. As Carter approached the boarding area, Pierce intercepted him with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Hey, you there in the costume, stop right there." Pierce's voice carried across the gate area, causing several passengers to look up from their phones and magazines. The word costume was deliberately chosen to demean and humiliate, suggesting that Carter was somehow playing dress-up rather than wearing his legitimate uniform. Carter stopped walking and turned to face the officer with the calm professionalism that had defined his entire career. Despite the shocking nature of Pierce's approach, Carter maintained his composure and responded in a clear, measured tone. "Excuse me, officer, I'm Captain Carter, and I need to board my aircraft." His voice carried no anger or defensiveness, just the quiet confidence of a man who knew he had every right to be exactly where he was. Pierce moved closer to Carter, his hostile body language making it clear that he viewed the pilot as some kind of threat. "That's a real convenient story. Where'd you get that fancy uniform? Halloween store?" The officer's words dripped with contempt and disbelief. In Pierce's biased worldview, it was impossible that this black man could legitimately be wearing a captain's uniform. Recognizing that he was dealing with a serious misunderstanding, Carter reached for his credentials while maintaining his professional demeanor. "Sir, I'm the assigned pilot for this flight. Here's my FAA license and airline ID." He produced his Federal Aviation Administration license, his official airline identification badge, and his airport security clearance. These documents represented years of training, testing, and professional achievement, but Pierce barely glanced at them. The officer waved dismissively at Carter's credentials, as if they were worthless pieces of paper. "Anyone can fake those. You think I'm stupid? You're not fooling anyone with this pilot act." Pierce's response revealed the depth of his prejudice. No amount of official documentation would convince him that Carter belonged in that uniform because his bias had already made the decision for him. By now, passengers waiting at Gate B-23 had begun to notice the confrontation unfolding near their departure gate. Some travelers looked up from their electronic devices with curiosity, while others began to sense that something was seriously wrong. A few passengers discreetly pulled out their cell phones, though they had not yet begun recording what they were witnessing. Following standard airline protocol when faced with any kind of delay or disruption, Carter attempted to contact his flight operations center to report the situation. He reached for his phone to make the call that would inform his supervisors about the unexpected confrontation that was preventing him from boarding his aircraft. This was exactly what any responsible pilot would do when faced with circumstances that could affect flight operations. Pierce immediately misinterpreted Carter's attempt to follow proper procedures as something sinister. In the officer's paranoid mindset, Carter's phone call was not a professional notification, but rather suspicious behavior that confirmed his worst fears. "Don't you dare make any calls!" Pierce shouted, his voice rising with anger and suspicion. The situation escalated rapidly as Pierce decided that he was dealing with a potential terrorist who was impersonating a pilot to gain access to an aircraft. He immediately called for backup on his radio, his voice urgent and alarmed. I need additional units at Gate B-23. I've got a possible terrorist here, impersonating a pilot. This guy is trying to access the aircraft. Carter stood frozen in disbelief as he listened to Pierce's radio call. The accusation of terrorism was so outrageous and so far from reality that Carter struggled to process what was happening. He maintained his calm exterior, but inside, he was beginning to understand that this situation was spinning completely out of control based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The flight attendants who were preparing Flight 447 for departure recognized Carter immediately. They had flown with him dozens of times and knew him to be one of the most professional and competent captains in the fleet. Seeing their captain being confronted by a police officer, several crew members approached the scene to offer their assistance and clarification. "Officer, this is Captain Carter," one of the flight attendants said respectfully. "He's our pilot for this flight. We've worked with him many times." The crew members hoped that their testimony would quickly resolve what they assumed was a simple case of mistaken identity. But Pierce was not interested in hearing from the flight attendants. His mind was already made up, and he dismissed their statements as easily as he had dismissed Carter's credentials. "You people could all be in on this together," Pierce replied, his paranoia now extending to the entire flight crew. "I don't know who to trust here." Within minutes, 3 additional Port Authority police officers arrived at Gate B-23 in response to Pierce's call for backup. The gate area, which had been buzzing with normal pre-flight activity just moments before, now resembled a crime scene. Passengers who had been casually waiting for their boarding calls were now pressed against windows and walls, trying to understand what kind of emergency was unfolding before their eyes. As Pierce briefed the backup officers about what he believed was happening, more passengers began pulling out their phones. The incident was about to be documented from multiple angles by dozens of witnesses, creating a permanent record of everything that was about to unfold. When the 3 backup officers arrived at Gate B-23, Pierce immediately took control of the briefing. His voice was filled with urgency and conviction as he explained what he believed was happening. "This guy is a terrorist impersonating a pilot to get access to the aircraft," Pierce told his colleagues with absolute certainty. "He's got fake credentials, and he's trying to fool everyone with this uniform. We need to take him down before he can carry out whatever he's planning." The backup officers looked at Carter, who stood calmly in his pristine pilot uniform, and then back at Pierce. Something about the situation did not feel right to some of them, but Pierce was the senior officer on scene, and they had been trained to trust their colleagues' judgment. Carter continued to address each new officer with the same patient professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "Officers, I'm Captain Tyrone Carter," he said clearly, making eye contact with each of the backup officers. "I'm the assigned pilot for Flight 447 to Los Angeles. Here are my credentials." He offered his FAA license, airline identification, and security clearance to each officer, hoping that fresh eyes might see what Pierce had refused to acknowledge. 2 of the backup officers examined Carter's credentials more carefully than Pierce had done. The documents looked legitimate, and Carter's calm demeanor was not what they would expect from someone trying to perpetrate a terrorist attack. However, Pierce had called them there because he believed there was a serious threat, and they felt obligated to support their fellow officers' assessment. "I don't care how good those fake documents look," Pierce declared when he saw his colleagues examining Carter's credentials. "This whole thing is too convenient. Real pilots don't just walk around terminals like this. We need to search him for weapons and explosives before he can get anywhere near that plane." Pierce's next action shocked everyone in the gate area. He ordered Carter to lie face down on the terminal floor for what he called a safety search. The humiliation was immediate and profound as Carter, a respected airline captain, was forced to comply with this degrading demand in front of hundreds of travelers. Carter lowered himself to the cold terminal floor, his uniform jacket pressing against the polished surface where thousands of travelers walked every day. The sight of a professional pilot being treated like a dangerous criminal sent murmurs of disbelief through the crowd of passengers. Many people began reaching for their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Pierce knelt on Carter's back while conducting his search, using a technique that had become tragically familiar to Americans who had watched similar scenes play out in cities across the country. The weight of the officer's knee pressed into Carter's spine as Pierce searched through every pocket of the pilot's uniform, looking for weapons or evidence that would justify his actions. The contents of Carter's flight bag were scattered across the terminal floor like pieces of evidence from a crime scene. Navigation charts, flight manuals, weather reports, and standard pilot equipment were spread out for everyone to see. These were the tools of Carter's profession, items that any real pilot would carry, but Pierce treated each object with deep suspicion. "Look at all this technical stuff," Pierce announced to his colleagues and the growing crowd of onlookers. "This could be some kind of code or bombing instructions. Real pilots don't need to carry this much paperwork." Pierce's paranoia was now so complete that he was treating legitimate pilot materials as potential terrorist equipment. The flight manuals that Carter carried contained standard procedures for aircraft operations, emergency protocols, and safety checklists that every responsible pilot studied regularly. The navigation charts showed flight routes across the United States that were used by thousands of commercial flights every day. The weather reports were routine meteorological information that helped pilots plan safe flights. But in Pierce's biased mind, these professional materials became sinister props in an elaborate terrorist plot. Carter remained motionless on the floor, enduring the humiliation with a dignity that impressed everyone who witnessed it. Despite the knee pressed into his back and the degrading treatment he was receiving, Carter continued to speak calmly to the officers. "Please look at my credentials carefully," he said, his voice slightly muffled by his position on the floor. "Call my airline's operations center. They will confirm everything I'm telling you." The backup officers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Carter's behavior was not consistent with that of a terrorist or criminal. He was cooperating completely, speaking respectfully, and providing detailed information that could easily be verified. His knowledge of aviation procedures and flight operations seemed genuine and extensive. Meanwhile, passengers throughout the gate area were becoming more vocal in their objections to what they were witnessing. "This is wrong!" shouted one traveler. "Let that man up!" called another. Several passengers had begun live streaming the incident on social media platforms, broadcasting the scene to audiences around the world. The flight attendants who knew Carter personally were becoming increasingly agitated as they watched their respected captain being treated like a criminal. "Officers, we've flown with Captain Carter dozens of times," one crew member pleaded. "He's one of the most professional pilots we know. This is a terrible mistake." But Pierce was not interested in listening to character references or professional testimonials. In his mind, the flight crew's support for Carter only confirmed that they were all part of some elaborate conspiracy. "How do I know you people aren't all working together?" Pierce demanded. "This could be a coordinated attack with multiple participants." As Carter lay on the terminal floor with Pierce's knee pressed into his back, the pilot maintained his focus on the safety of the passengers who were supposed to be under his care. Despite his own traumatic situation, Carter was thinking about Flight 447 and the 180 passengers who were depending on him to get them safely to Los Angeles. The scene had now been unfolding for over 25 minutes, and the crowd of witnesses continued to grow. Travelers from other gates had come to see what was causing the commotion, and many were expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Social media posts about the incident were beginning to spread beyond the airport, reaching audiences who were equally shocked by the treatment of the uniformed pilot. Pierce's determination to prove that Carter was an imposter had become an obsession that blinded him to all evidence to the contrary. Even as his fellow officers began to express doubts about the situation, Pierce doubled down on his original assessment and insisted that proper procedure required a thorough investigation of this suspected terrorist. The backup officers had run Carter's information through every federal database available to them, and the results were crystal clear. Every system confirmed that Tyrone Carter was exactly who he claimed to be: a licensed commercial airline pilot with an unblemished record, proper security clearances, and legitimate employment with the airline. The Federal Aviation Administration database showed his pilot credentials were current and valid. The Transportation Security Administration confirmed his airport access privileges. Even the FBI's terrorist watch lists showed no matches for Carter's name or information. Despite this overwhelming confirmation from multiple federal agencies, Pierce refused to accept what the databases were telling him. "These systems can be hacked," he declared to his increasingly uncomfortable colleagues. "Identity theft is getting more sophisticated every day. Just because the computer says he's a pilot doesn't mean anything. We could be dealing with someone who stole this guy's identity to carry out an attack. Pierce's fellow officers exchanged glances that revealed their growing doubts about their colleague's judgment. They had expected to find evidence supporting Pierce's terrorist theory, but instead, they were finding overwhelming proof that Carter was legitimate. The backup officers were beginning to realize that they were participating in the public humiliation of an innocent man. The Port Authority supervisor who had been called to the scene took one look at the federal database confirmations and immediately understood the magnitude of the mistake that was unfolding. This was no longer a security incident, but rather a potential civil rights violation that could result in serious legal and financial consequences for the agency. Pierce, the databases confirm this man's identity, the supervisor said firmly. We need to release him immediately. The supervisor's tone made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but a direct order that needed to be followed without delay. But Pierce was too invested in his original assessment to back down now. Sir, with respect, I think we're being too quick to trust these computer systems, Pierce argued with his supervisor. This could be an elaborate plot to fool us into letting our guard down. I think we should hold him until we can get federal agents down here to verify everything in person. The supervisor's patience was rapidly running out as he watched Pierce continue to defy common sense and direct orders. Officer Pierce, I am ordering you to release this man immediately, the supervisor said, his voice rising with authority and anger. We have confirmed his identity through multiple federal databases. His colleagues have vouched for him, and his credentials are legitimate. Release him now. Pierce's insubordination was now on full display as he argued with his superior officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. I just think we need to be absolutely certain before we let someone who might be a terrorist walk onto an aircraft, Pierce insisted. What if we're wrong? What if people get hurt because we didn't follow proper security procedures? The supervisor had heard enough. Officer Pierce, if you do not release this man immediately, you will face disciplinary action for insubordination and violation of civil rights, he warned. This is your final order. Remove those handcuffs right now. Finally, after 47 minutes of unjust detention, Carter felt the handcuffs being removed from his wrists. The metal restraints had been tight enough to leave visible marks on his skin, and his uniform was now wrinkled and soiled from being forced to lie on the terminal floor. Carter stood up slowly, brushing dust from his jacket and trying to restore some dignity to his appearance. The Port Authority supervisor immediately approached Carter with apologies, desperately trying to control the damage from what was clearly a public relations disaster. Captain Carter, I sincerely apologize for this incident, the supervisor said. This should never have happened, and we will be conducting a full investigation into Officer Pierce's conduct. Carter's response demonstrated the grace and professionalism that had defined his career. Despite the trauma he had just endured, his first concern was for the passengers who were depending on him to operate their flight safely. I appreciate your apology, Carter said calmly. Right now, I need to focus on getting my passengers to Los Angeles safely. Pierce showed no remorse for his actions, even as Carter was being released. I was just following proper security procedures, Pierce muttered to anyone who would listen. Better safe than sorry when it comes to aviation security. His refusal to acknowledge the wrongness of his actions only made the situation worse for everyone involved. Emergency medical technicians were called to examine Carter for any injuries he might have sustained during his detention. The physical examination revealed bruising on his wrists from the tight handcuffs and soreness in his back from having Pierce's knee pressed into his spine. More concerning was the psychological impact of being publicly humiliated and treated like a criminal while simply trying to do his job. Despite his ordeal, Carter made the professional decision that he was emotionally and physically capable of safely operating Flight 447. His years of training and experience had taught him to compartmentalize stress and focus on the task at hand, which in this case was getting 180 passengers safely to their destination. The passengers who had witnessed Carter's treatment responded with a sustained round of applause as he was finally released. Many travelers approached him to offer words of support and to express their outrage at what they had witnessed. We're proud to have you as our pilot, one passenger told Carter. What happened to you was completely wrong. Pierce was immediately escorted away from the gate area by his supervisors to prevent any further incidents. The officer would never again work an airport patrol shift, and his career in law enforcement was effectively over from that moment forward. As Carter prepared to board his aircraft and begin his pre-flight duties, passengers throughout Terminal 4 were already posting videos and photos of the incident on social media. The hashtag, our Justice for Captain Carter, was beginning to trend nationally as people shared their outrage at what they had witnessed. The incident that had started with one officer's racial bias was now spreading across the internet at lightning speed, reaching millions of people who were shocked by the treatment of the uniformed pilot. Carter had no idea that his ordeal was about to become a national symbol of racial injustice and police accountability. Within 6 hours of the incident at Gate B-23, the Port Authority of New York issued an official statement condemning Officer Pierce's actions and expressing deep regret for the treatment of Captain Carter. The agency's public relations team had been working frantically to respond to the growing crisis as videos of the incident spread across social media platforms at an unprecedented rate. The statement acknowledged that the officer's conduct was completely unacceptable and contrary to our values of treating all travelers with dignity and respect. Pierce was immediately placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a comprehensive investigation into his conduct. The Port Authority's Internal Affairs Division launched a formal inquiry that would examine not only Pierce's actions during the Carter incident, but also his entire employment history with the agency. Investigators began the process of reviewing every complaint that had ever been filed against Pierce, looking for patterns of behavior that supervisors had previously overlooked or dismissed. The investigation quickly revealed that Pierce's treatment of Captain Carter was not an isolated incident, but rather the most extreme example of a pattern of racial bias that had been building for years. Investigators found 7 previous complaints against Pierce involving interactions with minority travelers, airport employees, and aviation professionals. Each complaint told a similar story of Pierce questioning the legitimacy of Black and Hispanic individuals who had every right to be in the airport. The Port Authority's leadership realized that their supervisors had failed catastrophically in their duty to address these warning signs. The pattern of complaints against Pierce should have triggered additional training, closer supervision, or disciplinary action long before the Carter incident occurred. Instead, supervisors had dismissed each complaint as an isolated misunderstanding, allowing Pierce's bias to escalate unchecked until it resulted in a public humiliation that was now being viewed by millions of people worldwide. Public reaction to the incident was swift and overwhelming. Social media platforms exploded with outrage as users shared videos of Carter being handcuffed and forced to lie on the terminal floor. The hashtag #WowFlyingWhileBlack began trending nationally within hours, drawing comparisons to other incidents where Black professionals had been targeted by law enforcement while simply doing their jobs. Justice for Captain Carter became a rallying cry for people demanding accountability and reform in police departments across the country. Major civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union, issued immediate statements condemning the incident and demanding a federal investigation into Pierce's conduct and the Port Authority's handling of previous complaints against him. What happened to Captain Carter is a textbook example of racial profiling and police misconduct, said the NAACP's national president. This incident shows how Black professionals continue to face discrimination and humiliation simply for existing in spaces where others don't think they belong. Political leaders from across New York State expressed their outrage at the incident and promised comprehensive reforms to prevent similar occurrences in the future. The governor's office announced that it would be reviewing the Port Authority's training programs and oversight procedures to ensure that all employees receive proper education about civil rights and bias prevention. Several members of Congress called for federal oversight of airport policing practices and demanded hearings on racial profiling and transportation security. The aviation industry rallied around Carter with unprecedented solidarity. Professional pilot organizations issued statements supporting their colleague and highlighting the ongoing challenges faced by minority aviation professionals. The National Association of Black Pilots used the incident to draw attention to the lack of diversity in commercial aviation and the barriers that discourage minorities from pursuing careers as pilots. Captain Carter's treatment is a reminder that even when we achieve professional success, we are still seen as suspects rather than respected professionals. The organization's president stated, Carter retained a legal team led by prominent civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who had represented families in many high-profile cases of police misconduct. The legal team immediately began preparing a federal lawsuit against the Port Authority and Pierce personally, seeking damages for civil rights violations, false arrest, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. The attorneys announced their intention to seek $15 million in compensation for their client's suffering and to send a message that such conduct would not be tolerated. The evidence-gathering process was unusually straightforward because the entire incident had been captured on multiple cameras from different angles. Security footage from the airport's surveillance system provided a complete record of Pierce's actions, while dozens of passengers had recorded portions of the incident on their cell phones. Social media posts provided a real-time record of public reaction to the events as they unfolded, demonstrating the immediate and widespread outrage that Pierce's conduct had generated. Carter underwent a comprehensive medical examination to document the physical and psychological trauma he had suffered during his detention. Doctors found bruising on his wrists consistent with tight handcuffs and muscle strain in his back from being forced to lie on the floor with Pierce's knee pressed into his spine. Mental health professionals assessed Carter for signs of post-traumatic stress and other psychological impacts from the public humiliation he had endured. Despite his trauma, Carter demonstrated remarkable resilience and professionalism in his public statements about the incident. He appeared on major television networks to tell his story with dignity and grace, focusing on the need for police accountability and reform rather than seeking personal revenge against Pierce. "I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else," Carter told one interviewer. "We need to make sure that police officers receive proper training about bias and that there are real consequences when they violate people's civil rights." The incident sparked a national conversation about racial profiling in law enforcement and the particular challenges faced by black professionals who are often viewed with suspicion regardless of their credentials or accomplishments. Aviation experts noted that Carter's experience highlighted the ongoing lack of diversity in commercial aviation, where black pilots represent less than 3% of all commercial airline pilots in the United States. The Port Authority faced immediate calls for comprehensive reform of its policing practices and complaint procedures. Community leaders demanded the establishment of an independent oversight board to investigate allegations of misconduct and ensure that patterns of bias are identified and addressed before they escalate into incidents like Carter's detention. The financial implications of the incident were also becoming clear, as legal experts predicted that the agency would face the multi-million-dollar settlement that would be paid by taxpayers. 3 weeks after the incident at JFK Airport, Captain Carter's legal team filed a $15 million federal lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. The comprehensive complaint named the Port Authority of New York, Officer Aiden Pierce, and several supervising officers as defendants, alleging violations of Carter's civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. The lawsuit detailed specific charges including false arrest, assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The legal complaint painted a devastating picture of Pierce's conduct and the Port Authority's failure to address his pattern of racial bias. Carter's attorneys had meticulously documented every previous complaint against Pierce, demonstrating that the agency had ignored clear warning signs for years. The lawsuit argued that the Port Authority was liable not only for Pierce's actions on April 20th, but also for their deliberate indifference to his history of targeting minority travelers and airport employees. Expert witnesses lined up to support Carter's case included constitutional law scholars from prestigious universities, aviation safety experts, and specialists in police training and bias recognition. The legal team assembled a powerful array of testimony that would demonstrate the extent of Carter's professional reputation, the damage to his career and emotional well-being, and the systematic failures that allowed Pierce's misconduct to escalate unchecked. After 3 months of internal investigation, the Port Authority terminated Officer Pierce for gross misconduct, civil rights violations, and insubordination. The termination letter detailed Pierce's refusal to follow direct orders from supervisors, his pattern of racially biased conduct, and his violation of the agency's policies regarding respectful treatment of all travelers. The internal affairs investigation had confirmed a troubling pattern of complaints spanning 5 years, with Pierce consistently targeting minority individuals for enhanced scrutiny without justification. Pierce's termination carried severe financial consequences beyond the loss of his job. Under New York state pension rules, employees terminated for misconduct forfeit their retirement benefits, meaning that Pierce lost 15 years of accumulated pension contributions and future retirement security. His attempts to appeal the termination through the police union's grievance process were unsuccessful, with arbitrators upholding the agency's decision based on the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. The district attorney's office conducted a thorough review of Pierce's actions to determine whether criminal charges should be filed. Prosecutors examined potential charges including false imprisonment, assault, and violation of civil rights under federal statutes. However, after extensive consultation with federal authorities, the district attorney decided not to pursue criminal prosecution, citing the difficulty of proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt and the substantial civil remedies available to Carter through his federal lawsuit. Pierce's unsuccessful appeal of his termination revealed the depth of his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Even in formal grievance hearings, Pierce maintained that his conduct was justified and that he had been following proper security procedures. His inability to acknowledge the wrongfulness of his actions or show any remorse for the trauma he had inflicted on Carter only strengthened the case against him in the civil lawsuit. Settlement negotiations began 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, with federal mediators facilitating discussions between Carter's legal team and attorneys representing the Port Authority. The agency was eager to resolve the case quickly to avoid the negative publicity that would accompany a lengthy trial with extensive media coverage. The viral videos of Carter's detention had already caused significant damage to the Port Authority's reputation, and agency leaders wanted to begin the process of implementing reforms and rebuilding public trust. The mediation process revealed the strength of Carter's case and the Port Authority's vulnerability to a massive jury verdict. Legal experts following the case noted that similar incidents of racial profiling and false arrest had resulted in substantial settlements and jury awards across the country. The combination of clear video evidence, documented pattern of bias, and Carter's impeccable professional reputation created ideal conditions for a significant financial recovery. During settlement negotiations, Carter's attorneys emphasized that their client was seeking not only monetary compensation for his suffering, but also meaningful reforms that would prevent similar incidents from happening to other travelers. The legal team demanded that any settlement include provisions for enhanced bias training, revised complaint procedures, and independent oversight of the Port Authority's policing practices. The Port Authority's insurance carriers conducted their own assessment of the case and concluded that the agency faced potential liability far exceeding the $15 million Carter was seeking. Insurance adjusters noted that federal civil rights cases often resulted in substantial jury awards, particularly when the misconduct was captured on video and involved clear racial bias. The insurers recommended settling the case as quickly as possible to minimize the financial exposure. After 2 months of intensive mediation, the parties reached a settlement agreement that would fundamentally change how the Port Authority trains and supervises its police officers. The financial terms of the settlement were substantial, reflecting both the severity of Pierce's misconduct and the agency's institutional failures that allowed the incident to occur. The $12.8 million settlement became one of the largest in New York history for a single incident of police misconduct. The agreement included not only monetary compensation for Carter, but also comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future incidents of racial bias and improve accountability within the Port Authority Police Department. These reforms included mandatory bias training for all officers, revised arrest protocols, establishment of an independent oversight committee, and regular auditing of complaint procedures. The settlement also required the Port Authority to issue a formal public apology to Carter acknowledging the wrongfulness of Pierce's conduct and the agency's failure to address his pattern of bias. This public admission of liability was unusual in police misconduct settlements and demonstrated the strength of Carter's case and the agency's desire to begin rebuilding its damaged reputation. For Pierce personally, the settlement meant that he would face ongoing financial liability for his actions. While the Port Authority's insurance covered most of the settlement amount, Pierce remained personally liable for punitive damages and attorney fees, creating a substantial financial burden that would affect him for years to come. 2 years after the settlement, Captain Tyrone Carter had transformed from an unwilling victim into one of the most recognized advocates for aviation diversity and police accountability in the United States. Despite receiving the substantial financial compensation, Carter described the incident as fundamentally life-changing in ways that money could never address. The trauma of being handcuffed and humiliated in front of hundreds of travelers had left psychological scars that required ongoing therapy and counseling to overcome. Carter made the difficult decision to continue flying commercial aircraft, refusing to let Pierce's racist actions drive him away from the career he loved. However, his approach to his profession had evolved significantly since the incident at JFK Airport. Carter now carried additional documentation whenever he traveled, including letters from his airline's executives confirming his employment and pilot status. The fact that a decorated captain felt compelled to carry extra proof of his legitimacy highlighted the ongoing challenges faced by black professionals in aviation. The settlement money allowed Carter to establish the Captain Carter Foundation for Aviation Diversity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing minority representation in commercial aviation. The foundation provides scholarships for aspiring black and Hispanic pilots, mentorship programs connecting minority students with aviation professionals, and advocacy for policy changes that address barriers to entry in the aviation industry. Carter's foundation had already helped over 200 young people begin their journey toward careers as pilots, flight attendants, and aviation technicians. Carter became a sought-after speaker at conferences, congressional hearings, and university events where he shared his story and advocated for meaningful reform in law enforcement training and accountability. His testimony before the House Transportation Committee led to new federal guidelines for airport security procedures and enhanced civil rights training for transportation security personnel. Carter's calm, professional demeanor and compelling personal story made him an effective advocate for change at the highest levels of government. The psychological impact of the incident continued to affect Carter's daily life in ways that were not always visible to the public. He experienced anxiety when interacting with law enforcement officers and struggled with feelings of vulnerability that he had never experienced before the incident. Carter worked with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and found strength in connecting with other victims of police misconduct who shared similar experiences. Carter's family had also been profoundly affected by the incident and its aftermath. His wife Sarah became an advocate in her own right, speaking about the impact of racial profiling on families and the need for community support for victims of police misconduct. Their children, who were young at the time of the incident, had to cope with seeing their father treated as a criminal on national television and learning about racism in America at an earlier age than their parents had hoped. The Carter family used their platform to highlight the ongoing lack of diversity in commercial aviation, where black pilots still represented less than 3% of all airline pilots in the United States. Carter frequently spoke about the isolation and additional scrutiny that minority pilots faced in their careers, from flight training through their professional advancement. His foundation scholarship programs were specifically designed to address the financial barriers that prevented many qualified minority students from pursuing expensive pilot training programs. Meanwhile, former Officer Aiden Pierce had struggled to rebuild his life after his termination from the Port Authority Police Department. His career in law enforcement was permanently over, as no other agency would hire an officer who had been terminated for civil rights violations. Pierce attempted to find work in private security, but discovered that his involvement in the widely publicized incident made him unemployable in most security-related positions. Pierce's financial situation became increasingly difficult as he faced ongoing legal obligations related to the settlement and struggled to find stable employment. His marriage ended in divorce, partly due to the stress and public embarrassment caused by his actions at JFK Airport. Pierce was forced to sell his family home and move to a smaller apartment as he dealt with the financial consequences of his misconduct. Despite losing everything, Pierce showed little public remorse for his actions. In rare interviews, he continued to defend his conduct as appropriate security measures and expressed resentment about what he viewed as unfair treatment by his former employer. Pierce's inability to acknowledge the wrongfulness of his actions or show genuine remorse for the trauma he inflicted on Carter demonstrated the deep-rooted nature of his racial bias. The Port Authority had implemented the comprehensive reforms required by the settlement agreement, including mandatory bias training for all officers, revised complaint procedures, and establishment of an independent oversight committee. The agency hired diversity and inclusion consultants to review their hiring practices and developed new protocols for investigating allegations of racial profiling. These changes represented a fundamental shift in how the Port Authority approached civil rights and community relations. The oversight committee established as part of the settlement had already investigated dozens of complaints against Port Authority police officers and recommended disciplinary action in several cases where patterns of bias were identified. The committee's annual report showed a significant improvement in community relations and a reduction in complaints alleging racial profiling or discriminatory treatment. Captain Carter's story had become a case study in law enforcement training programs across the country, used to illustrate the consequences of racial bias and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect. Police academies incorporated video footage from the incident into their curricula as a powerful example of how officer bias could escalate a routine interaction into a traumatic encounter with serious legal and financial consequences. The incident at Gate B-23 had cost New York taxpayers nearly $13 million and destroyed the career of a 15-year police veteran. But it had also sparked important conversations about race, policing, and justice in America. Carter's courage in pursuing accountability through the legal system had resulted in meaningful reforms that would protect future travelers from similar treatment. Today, Captain Carter continues to fly commercial aircraft while advocating for the changes that he believes are necessary to create a more just and equitable society. His transformation from victim to advocate demonstrates the power of individuals to create positive change, even in the face of injustice and trauma. The legacy of April 20th, 2024 would be measured not only by the financial settlement or the officer's termination, but by the lasting reforms and increased awareness that Carter's courage had made possible.